Welcome to Novara Live, the first episode of 2025. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, are you feeling suitably refreshed after your break?
I'm feeling very refreshed, Michael. And for people who are thinking, where the hell is Aaron? Why does he look so different? Is he still on his Christmas holidays? I am coming to you direct from The Matrix, aka our spare room, for having some DIY done downstairs.
Yeah, I have to say, normally your backgrounds in your house make it look like a really nice property, but this looks terrible. You look like you're in prison or something. But there we go. You said DIY is going on. Hopefully it will look better soon. Coming up on tonight's show, we will close the show with an interview with John McDonnell. He's made an intervention in The Guardian, saying that Keir Starmer needs to watch out for the threat to his left as well as the threat to his right. Talking about the threat to his right, of course, we are going to be discussing Elon Musk. He is completely dominating British politics at the moment. The issue he has sort of reignited in the public debate concerns the real scandal over grooming gangs. We sort of had two minds about how to cover this because we don't really want to be led by Elon Musk when it comes to what we do and don't cover on a show. But we are going to do a deep dive into that issue because I think it is really important to get the facts out there when there's so much misinformation flying around online. In the first 6 days of 2025, there has only been one person shaping Britain's political conversation. And unfortunately, it's this man. Yes, Elon Musk, the world's richest man and member of the incoming Trump administration, has obsessively tweeted about UK politics multiple times a day since the 1st of January. I mean, it seems to be all anyone can talk about here. The issues Musk has focused on are the grooming gangs scandal in Rotherham, Rochdale and other English towns, and the plight of far-right activist Tommy Robinson. Now, as this is our first show back in the new year, we'll do this somewhat chronologically. And as far as I can tell, this was the first time Musk started tweeting about this particular issue in this round of discourse. So he's quote tweeting here Sam Ashworth-Hayes from The Telegraph on January the 1st, as you can see. Ashworth-Hayes is sharing a really appalling account of abuse by girls by grooming gangs when parents being arrested for trying to save them. Musk says so many peoples at all level of power in the UK need to be in prison for this. The most high-profile cases in the grooming scandal were in Rochdale, Rotherham and Oldham. These are historic cases, really. We're going to talk about them later in the show in detail on their own terms. For now, in terms of where Elon Musk fits into all of this, you need to know that Musk's interest appears to be recent and he's intervening in debates which seem to have been prompted by more recent reporting on the grooming scandal by GB News. If you're wondering, why are we talking about this now? Why are we talking about this again? It seems this was reporting by GB News partly about court cases which have sort of recently been concluded. Some sort of right-leaning journalists have been tweeting about it, and Musk has decided this is the issue I'm going to grab onto. Musk's interest in this also seemed at least, to be tied in with his support for reform. So he quote tweeted another screenshot from a trial of a child rapist saying, "Vote reform, it's the only hope." But then he went on to back a more extreme political figure. So again, this is also on the 1st of January. He was very busy, or I suppose not very busy because he had time to do all this tweeting. He said, "Why is Tommy Robinson in a solitary confinement prison for telling the truth? He should be freed, and those who covered up this travesty should take his place in that cell." In his tweeting an account, Inevitable West, Elon Musk is often tweeting these anonymous accounts with sort of names that sound like they're going to tweet racist stuff, and they often do. And this guy said, Tommy Robinson was smeared as a far-right racist for exposing the mass betrayal of English girls by the state. The nation owes him an apology. It's very much worth pointing out here, Tommy Robinson is in no shape or form in prison for telling the truth about grooming gangs or telling the truth about anything else for that matter. Instead, he's in prison for contempt of court after repeating false and libelous claims about a teenage Syrian refugee. What was then brought into this row, as I say, so many tweets over the past few days. We're just going to talk through the bits you really need to understand. What was brought into the round next was a letter from Jess Phillips to Oldham Council. This is a tweet from Charlie Peters from GB News. He's actually one of the people who's been sort of doing the reporting, which is getting this story back in the news. He says, exclusive, Labour has rejected Oldham Council's request for a government inquiry into grooming gangs GB News has seen a letter from Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips urging the council to organise their own inquiry. Context here, Jess Phillips' decision to turn down Oldham Council's request for a national inquiry is not particularly surprising. In fact, the Conservatives themselves made exactly the same decision in 2022, again saying back then that it would be better for the inquiry to be locally led instead of nationally led. However, Musk's wrath turned to Phillips anyway. He called her a rape genocide apologist, and in other tweets he called her a wicked witch and said she should be in prison. This is all quite threatening from a man with 200 million followers who's about to be in the White House with Donald Trump. And today, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer hit back.
Those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims. They're interested in themselves. Those who are cheerleading Tommy Robinson, not interested in justice. They're supporting a man who went to prison for nearly collapsing a grooming case, a gang grooming case. These are people who are trying to get some kind of vicarious thrill from street violence that people like Tommy Robinson promote. And those attacking Jess Phillips, who I'm proud to call a colleague and a friend, not protecting victims. Jess Phillips has done 1,000 times more than they've even dreamt about when it comes to protecting victims of sexual abuse throughout her entire career. And so just as I took on the criminal justice system and the institutions when I was chief prosecutor, I'm prepared to call out this for what it is. We've seen this playbook many times, whipping up of intimidation and threats of violence, hoping that the media will amplify it. Now, Jess Phillips does not need me or anybody else to speak on her behalf. But when the poison of the far right leads to serious threats to Jess Phillips and others, then in my book, a line has been crossed.
So later in that speech, Keir Starmer also hit out at politicians in the UK jumping on Musk's bandwagon. Now, that was likely principally a reference to Tory leader Kemi Badenoch, who on January the 2nd tweeted this: "The Times is long overdue for a full national inquiry into the rape gang scandal. Trials have taken place all over the country in recent years, but no one in authority has joined the dots. 2025 must be the year that the victims start to get justice." Now, this demand from Badenoch seems somewhat odd for two reasons. Most obviously, the Tories have been in power, or had been in power, for 14 years until last summer. So if Badenoch is saying justice is overdue, then surely that's her fault. She was in government for a number of years before she became leader of the opposition. Second, and this is really significant, a national inquiry into child sexual exploitation, which took 7 years and cost millions of pounds, was published in 2022. So there has been a national inquiry on the issue of child sexual exploitation in general, which did include these grooming gangs. Its recommendations have still not been implemented. So the writer of that report, Alexis Jay, said she was disappointed that the Tories hadn't implemented the recommendations, and the current government should hurry up with it instead of doing another full inquiry. Let's end this segment, before I go to Aaron, on the other party whom Musk's tweets have impacted, namely that's Reform. So as I explained earlier, Musk began the year by tweeting his support for Reform, along with much of the other incendiary things we've just explained to you. And this weekend, Farage was challenged on whether he endorsed Musk's various other views.
Real friends, when they meet face to face, have conversations, and they agree to agree, and sometimes they agree to disagree. And that is what open society and free speech is all about.
But have you or anyone in your team said to Elon Musk that his calls for Tommy Robinson to be released from prison, a convicted offender, somebody on the far right who you yourself work very hard to distance yourself from, have you told him that he's wrong about that?
I think you're missing the point. The point is the fact that he supports me politically and supports Reform doesn't mean I have to agree with every single statement he makes on X. And I think you're getting bogged down in this. You know, I will, at the inauguration, have a conversation with him on a variety of things. This will no doubt be one of them.
So Nigel Farage thinks friends should be able to disagree, and he thinks he's going to be having a chummy conversation with Elon Musk at the inauguration of Donald Trump later this month. Elon Musk, soon after that interview aired, sent a tweet that put that confidence somewhat in doubt. Elon Musk says, the Reform Party needs a new leader. Farage doesn't have what it takes. He is a fickle man. Of course, Farage has, been looking quite pleased with himself, understandably, for having the support of the world's richest man. That's always very handy. But now Elon Musk has turned against him. Aaron, we are going to be talking sort of later in the show in more detail about what our audience does need to know about the grooming gangs crisis. Of course, it's not new. This is back in the news in part because, some right-wingers want it to be. But now I want to focus on sort of the politics of this. Musk, his impact on British politics just seems enormous right now. Some people might be watching thinking, why are you even talking about this? Why are you giving Elon Musk oxygen? Do you think his tweeting from the United States about Britain, does it matter?
Well, it matters, but I don't know if it's all important for the likes of reform. There's an argument to be made that actually Elon Musk distancing himself from Farage is useful for Nigel Farage. He occupies a quite interesting space now where he's anti-establishment, he's against the Uni Party, he opposes the Tories, he opposes Labour, he wants to break with politics as usual, but he's not Tommy Robinson. He's not the far right. I think for Nigel Farage, that's quite a profitable place to be, politically speaking. Of course, if he doesn't get money that was perhaps being pledged to him by Elon Musk, something akin to £78 million, $100 million was the figure that was being bandied around. Of course, that would have completely reconfigured British politics. I'm sure reform would quite like that money. But notwithstanding that, I don't think the politics of this are particularly bad. There's nobody out there, a British voter, in a marginal, which reform are looking to potentially do well in the next general election. There are not voters in these places saying, I was going to vote for reform, but now Elon Musk has pontificated on X that actually until Rupert Lowe becomes the party leader, I'm going to stay clear. Where else are they going to go? They're not going to vote Tory if their major issues are reducing immigration, they're happy with the last 14 years of government, so on and so on. So I don't think it matters that much to reform. I think Elon Musk's interventions are a massive boost to the radical right in this country more generally, to the right beyond the Conservative Party. I certainly think it disadvantages progressive and left-wing politics, certainly. But the extent to which Elon Musk is a game changer for or against reform, I don't know. A really interesting hypothesis, Michael, is this. Tommy Robinson will come out of prison. That's going to happen. One imagines, unless he continues to just sabotage himself and claim he's Luton's answer to Nelson Mandela. He will eventually come out of prison. And there is potentially a world where Tommy Robinson is supported by Elon Musk, where Elon Musk says, this is the guy who I need to big up when it comes to disrupting British politics. Now, if Tommy Robinson is criticising and attacking Nigel Farage and reform relentlessly with the backing of Elon Musk, that's a major problem. That's a major problem for reform because it's a part of their coalition. Worse still is if Tommy Robinson, for some reason, wants to basically start some meme party, some Tommy Robinson party, and that got 3, 4, 5% in the general election. It's not going to do anything. It's just going to split the vote on the radical right. So this could be very bad for reform. Right now, I think it's sort of net neutral, if anything, positive in a slight direction. But I do think more broadly, the contours, the parameters of British politics are being adjusted at breakneck speed. We did see over the weekend, and I think this is the real story here, Michael, when it comes to British politics. We did see over the weekend, Nigel Farage getting talked about more than the Prime Minister. He has been the primary British political figure over the weekend, fundamentally. If you want BBC Politics on the website, the BBC News website, onto the UK politics page, I think their 3 biggest stories were Farage. And that is very, very good, potentially, for his political brand. And it really is not usual in politics for a man leading a party of 5 MPs to get that kind of exposure.
Someone who seems to want to get more of the limelight than potentially he's currently getting. So, of course, Elon Musk is tweeting his bile from the USA. Robert Jenrick is tweeting his bile from this country. He's currently Shadow Justice Minister, isn't he? He wanted to be leader of the Conservative Party. This is what he tweeted on the weekend. He said, to sustain order in multicultural Britain, the state considered it necessary to apply the law selectively. For decades, the most appalling crimes from predominantly British Pakistani men were legalised and actively covered up to prevent disorder. The rule of law was abandoned to sustain the myth that diversity is our strength, destroying the lives of thousands of vulnerable white working-class girls in the process. This appalling affair is the final nail in the coffin for liberals who still cling to the argument that Britain is an integration success story. This is the really, really explosive bit, or the really incendiary bit. The scandal started with the onset of mass migration, importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women brought us here, and after 30 years of this disastrous experiment, we now have entrenched sectarian voting blocs that make it electoral suicide for some MPs to confront this. This scandal shows why we must end it. The foreign nationals responsible must be deported, no ifs, no buts, and the officials that covered up must be sent to jail for their appalling cowardice. Even that won't be enough for the victims. So he's sort of tarring in, well, even just saying the importing of hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures, and sort of saying that these actions taken by, rapists and groomers and terrible, terrible people, he's clearly trying to use that to tar all Muslims or South Asians or Pakistanis with that really, really horrible brush. That tweet from Jenrick prompted this rebuttal from a Tory, or a former Tory, advisor on the BBC.
My blood is boiling because of what Robert Jenrick said. I don't think that Elon Musk or Nigel Farage are the most dangerous individuals in our country. I think Robert Jenrick has the potential to be the most divisive person in our political history. I think some of his words over the last 12 months may result in some people maybe even dying, because he has the potential to incite hatred in ways that I have never seen. Nigel Farage...
You're saying that about someone in your own party?
Jenrick, Nigel Farage, he talks about the things that many people in our country care about, and he articulates himself in a way that sometimes I don't like, but actually he doesn't cross the line. Like, Robert Jenrick regularly crosses the line.
And we should say he's not here to defend himself,
and
but it's
probably should come next week and maybe try and justify some of the words that he has been using recently. Completely inappropriate, uncalled for, unjustifiable, and wrong. He needs to tone it down, and he needs to do that soon, or else we're going to have a really terrible 2025 in this country.
Aaron, do you agree with that assessment of what Robert Jenrick tweeted? Of course, it's not a random tweet. This is very much in line with what he's been saying for the past few weeks and indeed months.
Yes, the claim that he could potentially be the most dangerous person in Britain's political history is obviously a very bold one. But I mean, that's the word, isn't it? It's potential. Maybe, we don't know. I mean, you certainly wouldn't put him on a par with somebody like Enoch Powell. Other people, of course, before the war, Second World War, Oswald Mosley, quite divisive chap. I wouldn't put Jenrick in that category. But he's saying potentially. I mean, there was lots of ire directed to that man by conservative activists on Twitter. But, he's saying prospectively in the future, he thinks it's plausible given what Jenrick said so far. We'll see. We'll see. I do think that reform would be in a very different situation if Jenrick was the Tory leader. But I also think Jenrick probably wouldn't be so bold with his rhetoric if he was the Tory leader. He'd be seeking to build the kind of coalition needed to win a general election. You can't do that with that kind of rhetoric. You may get some voters on board. You're going to lose some too. Okay. And I think this is something which serious conservatives know. They lost a ton of votes right across the south of England, that blue wall, all the way from Somerset and Cornwall, all the way through to Kent, often affluent, sort of middle class, tended to vote Remain, not always, but tended to vote Remain voters. Places like Chichester, Winchester, in Devon, right across the south. They lost those kinds of seats. Portsmouth North, I mean, that was a Leave voting place, but similar story. The two Bournemouth seats, relatively affluent, they've voted Tory since forever. I think Chichester basically had voted for a Conservative, for a couple of hundred years. And that's just a fact that many sort of Conservative activists online don't really want to engage with. But park that for a moment. On the nature of what Jenrick wrote in that second tweet, just factually wrong. He's talking about quote unquote multiculturalism being a 30-year project. Why is he saying 30 years? Well, of course, that broadly aligns with the new Labour government. 1997 was 28 years ago. Apparently, multiculturalism starts in 1995. Okay, well, nobody thinks that. Furthermore, the groups involved in these rape gangs, grooming gangs, People on the right again say grooming gang doesn't quite capture what's happening here. I think grooming is quite an important word because they're trying to build trust with the victims and the survivors, and that's the way they insert themselves in their lives. But the people involved in these grooming gangs tended to come in places like Rochdale and Rotherham, are men from South Asian backgrounds, Pakistani. Those communities began to come to the United Kingdom a lot further back than 30 years ago, right? We're talking about people that were economic migrants invited to come to this country because there wasn't enough labor in mill towns in order to keep Britain's cotton industry ticking over. That's why those communities came here in the first place. They were invited here. So the idea that people from Pakistan or India, but we're talking in this particular case about men from Pakistan, the idea that they've only come here in the last 30 years is just complete nonsense. It's just factually not true. So if you're going to criticize certain communities being here, you're going to have to go a lot further back. Now, of course, Robert Jenrick doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to talk about immigration since the 50s and the 60s because, of course, that implicates all politicians of all stripes for more than his entire life. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to talk about certain issues being the responsibility and lay blame at not just the Labour Party, but a certain genus of the Labour Party, aka hyper-liberal New Labour, since 1997. I mean, it's just factually not true. He also talks about communities and people from different, I can't remember the correct word, Michael, but people from basically different backgrounds. On the one hand, he'll say that, but on the other hand, people like Jenrick will say, well, I'm talking about a very specific community. I'm not just talking about Muslims, I'm talking in these particular areas about Pakistani men. That's what they say. That's their line. So if you're saying communities, what communities are they? Tell me. Be honest about it, because I hear both lines of argument at different times. And then you've got the point that was made by that gentleman there, in regards to the divisiveness of all of this. You've got somebody like, for instance, this is really remarkable for me, Michael. Ben Habib, the former co-chair of Reform, is half Pakistani. So does Robert Jenrick think that Ben Habib should leave the country? I mean, I think that's a really fair and robust line of questioning. You're saying that somebody like Ben Habib, I would suggest, according to Robert Jenrick's kind of calculus, he would be an immigration success story. Someone like Ben Habib, half European, I think half British, half Pakistani. I presume his father came over a relatively long time ago. He's an older chap. He's in his 50s, maybe early 60s. He's half Pakistani. Are you saying he shouldn't be here? I think these are the kinds of questions. That's the line of questioning that I would like to hear from the media. So what Jenrick is saying, yes, of course, I think it borders on incitement. In some instances, factually wrong, but also I just think deeply unhelpful. When you have literally people on his own political side, people of Pakistani heritage, effectively being included within the kind of rhetoric he's deploying.
I should have said his name in my introduction or when I was sort of introducing the video. He's called Samuel Kasumu, the former Conservative advisor. He was a number 10 advisor, I think, during the Boris Johnson years. Thanks to a raft of incendiary tweets from Elon Musk, the scandal of gangs of predatory men raping vulnerable young girls in British towns and cities is back in the news. Musk has only jumped on the story because in his reading, it fits into a far-right narrative of Muslim men being a threat to white girls and women and liberal elites letting them get away with it. But what's the truth? What actually happened? Well, we can begin with one fact we know for sure. For decades, British authorities in working-class communities failed thousands of young girls who were groomed, raped and sold for sex by gangs of men. From Telford to Rochdale and Rotherham to Oxford, vulnerable girls were preyed upon by men posing as their friends or boyfriends who plied them with drugs and alcohol and threatened violence if the girls ever revealed what was happening to them. And yes, many of those girls in these high-profile situations were white, and many of those men were of South Asian descent. It's important to acknowledge that. Failing to do so feeds a right-wing narrative involving widespread cover-ups. But there have also been plenty of less widely reported cases of white men forming grooming gangs too. For some reason, they don't seem to attract the media attention that gangs dominated by Asian men do. And the truth is that data on the ethnicity of perpetrators nationally remains sketchy at best. A 2020 Home Office report says this. Beyond specific high-profile cases, the academic literature highlights significant limitations to what can be said about links between ethnicity and this form of offending. Research has found that group-based child sexual exploitation offenders are most commonly white. Some studies suggest an overrepresentation of Black and Asian offenders relative to the demographics of national populations. However, it is not possible to conclude that this is representative of all group-based CSE offending. This is due to issues such as data quality problems, the way the samples were selected in studies, and the potential for bias and inaccuracies in the way that ethnicity data is collected. So I suppose to translate that, if you've been looking at this debate on Twitter, what you'll see is lots of people on the left saying the majority of grooming gangs are white, lots of people on the right saying, but disproportionately, grooming gangs are more likely to be made up of, well, they say Asian men. And the Home Office is essentially saying none of the data is good enough to really make any claim at all. Of course, you have to wonder why by 2020, when that report was written, police were still failing to properly record this data. Indeed, in 2022, the report of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse made this specific point about data gathering by the police. Many of the high-profile child sexual exploitation prosecutions have involved groups of men from minority ethnic communities. This has led to polarized debate about whether there is any link between ethnicity and child sexual exploitation networks. Poor or non-existent data collection makes it impossible to know whether any particular ethnic group is overrepresented as perpetrators of child sexual exploitation by networks. Now, the chair of that inquiry in 2022 was Alexis Jay, and years earlier, she had also chaired the 2013 independent inquiry established by Rotherham Borough Council into the terrible cases of grooming in that town. Now, her report made headlines around the world, and this was Jay describing her findings in 2014.
They were raped by multiple perpetrators. They were trafficked to other towns and cities in the north of England. They were abducted, beaten, and intimidated. There were examples of children being doused with petrol and threatened with being set alight. They were threatened with guns, made to witness brutally violent rapes, and threatened they would be the next if they told anyone. Girls as young as 11 were raped by large numbers of male perpetrators.
Now, at the time and in that report, Jay was also clear about who had failed the girls in Rotherham. This is from that report. Over the first 12 years covered by this inquiry, the collective failures of political and officer leadership were blatant. From the beginning, there was growing evidence that child sexual exploitation was a serious problem in Rotherham. This came from those working in residential care and from youth workers who knew the young people well. Within social care, the scale and seriousness of the problem was underplayed by senior managers. At an operational level, the police gave no priority to CSE regarding many child victims with contempt and failing to act on their abuse as a crime. Further stark evidence came in 2002, 2003 and 2006, with 3 reports known to the police and the council which could not have been clearer in their description of the situation in Rotherham. The first of these reports was effectively suppressed because some senior officers disbelieved the data it contained. This had led to suggestions of cover-up. The other 2 reports set out the links between child sexual exploitation and drugs, guns, and criminality in the borough. These reports were ignored and no action was taken to deal with the issues that were identified in them. Now, that pattern of repeated failure by the authorities to protect working-class girls from sexual predators is one that has been repeated in every grooming scandal across the country. In 2015, 12 men were sentenced for the sexual exploitation of 2 underage teenage girls in Keighley, West Yorkshire. But 12 years earlier, in 2003, then Labour MP for Keighley, Anne Cryer, had been amongst the first politicians to speak out about the exploitation of vulnerable girls in the area. This is Cryer speaking to the BBC in 2017.
Some 7 mothers came to see me, and they had genuine concerns about the way their daughters were being abused by this gang. It had all started from having a boyfriend at school, a very handsome, attractive young man from the Pakistani community, who then handed them on to much older men. The mothers had ganged up together in order to get the police to be active on it. The police kept saying to them that due to the fact that they felt fairly sure that the girls had been consenting, probably under the influence of drugs and drink, but consenting, there was nothing they could do. Nearly all of these girls were 12 and 13. Whether it had been with consent or without consent, it was a criminal offence. I had no doubts in my own mind about it. I really wanted to help them, and I wanted it to stop.
Just 30 miles south of Keighley, others were trying to blow the whistle in Rochdale. Sarah Robotham was manager of the Rochdale Crisis Intervention Team, a hub set up by the Blair government to reduce rates of teenage pregnancy. Now, in 2017, she told the BBC how information about child exploitation began to emerge soon after they opened their doors in 2003.
Very quickly, we started to identify a number of young people who were incredibly vulnerable, who were engaging in sexual activity which wasn't necessarily by choice. It was something that they felt they needed to do. It became a situation where we would identify one girl who was vulnerable, and then she would come along with her other friends, and they were equally vulnerable. We got little snippets of information from each girl about their life, really, and what they were experiencing. They would tell us that their boyfriend was a taxi driver, or that they were enjoying getting really drunk at weekend and at a party where there were lots of adult men.
Now, some of the victims of the Rochdale gang spoke to the BBC anonymously. Here, actors voice their words as they describe their experiences. In the middle, you'll also hear from Robotham again.
My friend used to go out with Pakistani men. One night she took me out as well. I didn't know any Pakistani people. I only saw them in takeaways and driving taxis. They go on like they like you. They want to be boyfriend. I actually believed them. I was 14 years old. They bought us drinks. I thought, I'll have some of this. It got to the point where I was really drunk. One slept with my friend, and then after he's finished, another went in and slept with her. Then they'd done the same with me. Slightly was passing us about.
There were often occasions when girls were there outside our building at 8:30, 8:15 in the morning. They were waiting for us to arrive. They'd been up all night. They were really smelly, totally dishevelled, really frightened. There was one girl who'd been dumped on the moors. She'd walked about 6 miles to get to our building. She'd been raped. She'd been thrown out of a car, that there were a number of men who'd had intercourse with her.
I got myself in some really bad states. I used to always go there because there was someone to talk to. I used to tell them everything. I just felt safe there.
There was a woman who used to work in the clinic. She was like a sister. She was like, "What are you doing?" She used to say to me "These men, they don't love you. They're not going to marry you. They're not going to take you back home to the mum. You're there to do stuff with them and then go. That ain't love. Getting you drunk and then abusing you."
That clip was from the Betrayed Girls, a BBC documentary from 2017. A number of the clips we've shown and we're going to show are from that documentary. I have to say, it's a really, really powerful documentary. I recommend you watch it. What these girls went through was horrific. And the story time and again is sort of, you have some very brave social workers, people working with them, youth workers who are trying to blow the whistle on this, and no one wants to listen. And the people not wanting to listen included the police. This is from that documentary. We're going to show you Anne Cryer, so the MP, and Sarah Robotham, the youth worker, who described what happened when they tried to get the police involved.
We called the police every time. We spoke to the police every time. I kept being told, the police can't do anything unless you have a victim, okay? You only have a victim if the victim is prepared to make a statement. Now, often the children couldn't articulate that anyway. They couldn't articulate. Aside from that, I think they were really frightened. They were really frightened of the consequences. They'd been hit, threatened. "I know where you live. I know who your mum is. I'll kill members of your family." I think they were frightened as well about my parents might be disappointed, or I might get in trouble at school, or my friends might find out, all of which is a child mind, it's a child way of thinking.
I probably went to see the police about once a month over a 12, 18 months period. and they always had a new excuse for not doing anything. I followed it up with the head of social services at that time, and she told me, well, there's not a great deal we can do because these children are not in care. They're with their parents, and therefore it's the responsibility of the parents, not of the local authority.
Now, we are going to sort of talk a bit later in this segment about sort of claims that maybe this was due to political correctness at the police or people didn't respond correctly to this. Now, I think that might have played a small role, but what you're hearing over and over again, is people saying, these are the kind of girls who are asking for it. They're not credible. You know, if they go to the courts, they're not going to be credible, so there's no point in listening to them anyway if a prosecution isn't going to come from this. And also, you know, they're probably consenting to this. They know what they're doing. Now, you heard from the social worker, and we've seen time and time again from the prosecution of these cases that these are children, 12, 13, 11. The idea that these can be consenting to having sex with multiple men in their 20s and 30s, right, is not just a legal nonsense, it's a moral atrocity. When it comes to the police, we've shown you there sort of people trying to blow the whistle, sort of adults in position of responsibility trying to get agencies involved. Victims of the gangs also had little trust in the police. So one spoke anonymously to the BBC, and this was with an actor voicing her words here.
The police knew about it, but nothing ever got done. You know, a few times the police have turned up at a house where we've all been drinking, and, you know, I've been upset saying things have happened. They don't really listen. I'm crying to the police, but you've got all the men stood there. They're all just saying, ignore her, she's drunk. I'm crying, I'm screaming, I was upset, I was hurt. And the police are like, oi, enough is enough. Then you're the one who gets arrested when all you're doing is crying out for a bit of help.
So you cry out for help and you get arrested, right? Now, again, I think the issue here is class, right? I think if you'd had a young person there who was, you know, able to articulate themselves in a posh accent, you know, if their parents had gone to the cops, I think the cops would have responded quite differently to these working class girls in these northern towns, right? A report published in January last year into Greater Manchester Police's handling of various investigations into Rochdale grooming gangs was scathing over the way the police treated the victims. Here's one of its findings. We have heard evidence that many victims gave interviews identifying numerous men who had exploited them in the belief these men would be charged with offences against them. We have found that many of these crimes were not formally recorded or investigated by Greater Manchester Police. Furthermore, promises to support the victims during and after the trial were not forthcoming, and these young people were left to be harassed and intimidated by the men who had previously abused them. Although GMP required the engagement of these individuals to achieve a successful prosecution, it is not surprising, given the lack of support our interviewees described, that so many survivors declined to engage in subsequent investigations. Now, that kind of class-based victim blaming was also a feature of other grooming cases, and in some, the police were even more hostile to the victims. 17 men and 1 woman were jailed in 2017 for the sexual exploitation of 22 women and girls. That was a result of a formal police operation that identified up to 700 victims of grooming in the northeast. But a report found that before the launch of the operation, police appeared to punish girls who came forward rather than helping them. This is one part of that report. While perpetrators were not punished or disrupted, attempts to persuade victims to change behaviours and not return to the abusers led to consideration of deterrent punishments of victims for being drunk and disorderly or for making false allegations when accounts were changed. Some victims were placed in secure accommodation. This sent an unhelpful message to perpetrators. They were unlikely to be prosecuted or prevented from continuing to abuse, encouraging an arrogant persistence. It also had a significant impact on victims who learned that nothing would be done against perpetrators. They're trying to deter the young people by sort of punishing them instead of listening to them. And sadly, it seems not a lot seems to have changed since then. Just a year ago, in December 2023, the Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services found that British police were still unable to see the victims of grooming gangs as victims, blaming them for their own sexual abuse instead. Classism and misogyny, though, are not the main issues which appear in political debate, and certainly aren't the big issues which are appearing on Twitter at the moment when grooming gangs are discussed. So in the wake of the 2014 Rotherham report, then Home Secretary Theresa May said institutionalised political correctness had made the authorities too afraid to tackle gangs of South Asian perpetrators. And as further grooming gang cases came to light, former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said this in early 2023.
With the specific issue of grooming gangs, we've had several independent inquiries look at the incidents here in Rochdale, but in Rotherham and Telford. And what's clear is that when victims and other whistleblowers came forward, their claims were often ignored by social workers, local politicians, or even the police. And the reason that they were ignored were due to cultural sensitivity and political correctness.
It's not completely implausible, right, that local authorities, social workers and police all ignored mass rape in their cities and councils because they didn't want to stir up racial tensions. They thought this would be too incendiary and we can't possibly look into this because the consequences would be terrible. However, it could also be true that these institutions had little interest in believing girls they regarded as dispensable. And in her report into Rotherham, Alexis Jay presented a much more nuanced picture than either Theresa May or Rishi Sunak presented there. So this is what she actually said in the report. Within the council, we found no evidence of children's social care staff being influenced by concerns about the ethnic origins of suspected perpetrators when dealing with individual child protection cases, including CSE. In the broader organisational context, however, there was a widespread perception that messages conveyed by some senior people in the council and also the police were to downplay the ethnic dimensions of CSE. Unsurprisingly, frontline staff appeared to be confused as to what they were supposed to say and do and what would be interpreted as racist. So lots of confusion, essentially. Another piece of context, though, which is really important, is that Jay did find ways in which stereotypes about the South Asian community in Rotherham may have failed even more victims, ones the right don't seem to care that much about. Here's what Jay said on this issue. So she said, there was too much reliance by agencies on traditional community leaders, such as elected mayors and imams, as being the primary conduit of communication with the Pakistani heritage community. The inquiry spoke to several Pakistani heritage women who felt disenfranchised by this and thought it was a barrier to people coming forward to talk about child exploitation. Others believed there was wholesale denial of the problem in the Pakistani heritage community in the same way that other forms of abuse were ignored. Representatives of women's groups were frustrated that interpretations of the borough's problems with child sexual exploitation were often based on an assumption that similar abuse did not take place in their own community and therefore concentrated mainly on white girls. So in other words, women in Pakistani communities in Rotherham complained that a failure to address the issue of child abuse head on, instead of talking to community leaders, right, that meant that girls in their community weren't being protected either. Now, of course, those aren't the kind of girls that fit the narrative Elon Musk and his followers are trying to spin. Aaron, we wanted to sort of do this section on its own terms because, this is an important issue. It can't sort of just be said, oh, this is all just a right-wing moral panic. There were real failures by the state, but we shouldn't be having this conversation on the terms of Elon Musk. And I think when you look into it, the principal factors that allowed this to happen was state agencies, either through pretty much through incompetence and laziness, basically, said, we don't want to deal with this. These are working class girls. They're troubled girls. They're asking for it. They're not going to be credible enough to sort of stand up in a court of law. So what's the point? Let's just leave them to it. And I think that's principally what allowed this to happen. Now, those reports, they say at particular periods in certain high-profile cases, worries about political correctness or worries about community tensions may have played some role, but the principal role here seems to be class, misogyny, incompetence, laziness. What's your interpretation of this?
I think that's entirely right. You can talk about the political correctness stuff. I mean, that's important. There's some evidence of that. But the major problem here is, like you say, incompetence around the police, local authorities, councillors, elected officials, council officers. And that's a real problem. And we can talk about that through a number of prisms, can't we? We can say, well, this is the result of a shift to a low trust society and people don't have principles and integrity. And instead, they talk about all this management speak of accountability and scrutiny and transparency. By the way, anybody who uses words like that, They don't actually believe in any of those concepts. Those words are deployed often by the professional managerial class precisely to evade accountability, transparency, scrutiny. And they don't think of themselves as individuals having agency, individuals being responsible. It's always about organizations. We can go back as well to another scandal, not as bad as this, but still very, very bad. The post office scandal. You had the sort of management types, like I think Paula Vennell's her name was, talking in those kinds of terms. But when it came to the individual level of action, how am I relating to this problem, this potential perpetrator, this potential victim or survivor, this potential moral issue, they're not present. They're MIA. So I think it does speak to a certain degeneration, in regards to public service culture, and like you say, incompetence. I mean, my goodness, Michael, when was the last time the police in this country, in terms of everyday community policing, I'm not talking about SO15 or the firearms unit, killing a terrorist trying to murder people in central London. When was the last time somebody relayed a positive story about the police actually helping working people? I only hear complaints about policing in this country. Now, I know as many of our viewers, as many people on the left have a structural critique of the police. They would say defund the police or abolish the police, or the police aren't the solution, prisons aren't the solution. It's a different debate. Okay, I'm not talking about rates of recidivism and do we rehabilitate, do we deter, what's the point of prisons, what's the point of the criminal justice system. I'm literally talking here about the nuts and bolts of, do we have intelligent, determined, hardworking, publicly minded individuals working in institutions like the police force? I mean, I'm sure we do have some of them, but not many. And that really is a story we see time after time after time. That's often put at the forefront of the national conversation through the prism of the London Metropolitan Police Service, because of course our media class is addicted to stories about the M25 and everything that happens inside it. Here's another thing, Michael. Now, I'm not suggesting there aren't any cases like this which didn't happen in London. I'm sure some stuff will probably come out over the next year. I have no idea. But obviously, cases of malpractice, neglect by state agencies happen inside London. Of course they do. But there is a big part of the story as well, Michael, that with regards to Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, and of course many other places too, Oldham, the drip nature of these stories over the 2000s, I think actually is hard for us to comprehend for two reasons. The first is it was outside the M25, right? And actually until the Brexit debate, until 2015, 2016, until about 10 years ago, the media class in this country did not care about what happened outside London. They didn't. And at the same time, you had the collapse of local journalism. You had the collapse of court reporting. And so this story was out there. We just watched excerpts from a BBC documentary in 2017. It was covered in various newspapers, original investigation, opinion reporting. It was out there. But I feel like it would have been relayed in a quite different way if it was inside London. I think that's another factor as well. You talk about the class element, for sure. If these were middle-class girls being treated like that, of course the police would have responded very differently. I also think that the story would have been relayed and narrated very differently if it was, like I say, inside the M25. And of course, another aspect of this, Michael, is it was a pre-social media era. I feel like, this kind of stuff, and we criticize social media, we criticize mobile phones a lot as a society, but also on this show, Michael. I know you and I have our critiques of mobile phones. I suspect it would be much, much harder to get away with this kind of stuff now than it was 20 years ago. That would be my suspicion. I might be wrong, but that would be my suspicion. And that's part of actually when you look at how the police just ignored these young girls and their families, and also professionals trying to make their case for them. When you look at that, it does feel almost like an alien society, because I feel like mobile telephony, camera phones, social media has changed a lot of that dynamic, a heck of a lot. I mean, that's really, it's really hard to overstate how much it's changed that dynamic over the last 15 to 20 years. So that's something I think for people to dwell on. And look, for people on the left, who want an improved criminal justice system, I don't think the answer, I'm not suggesting people are saying this, but the answer to police and state agencies neglecting these young women, letting them down catastrophically in places like Telford, Rotherham and Rochdale, catastrophically. I don't think, the left response should be, well, we need fewer police, right? I don't think that's the answer. Now, I don't have the answers. But I do think we need a big conversation about, as people on the left, as socialists, we believe in the public realm. We believe in looking after the vulnerable, the people that cannot look after themselves. Of course, we want to look after everybody, but particularly those who can't look after themselves. How do you ensure the state does that? And I think that's the kind of question that, the left hasn't really focused on for a very long time. And something that makes me quite sad in this whole story is how a lot of people, particularly on the right, particularly on social media, look at this stuff through a left-right perspective. The left is cool with it. The left is, on side with it, and then the right are fighting the good fight. And I find that, I'll use this word again, catastrophic. It's catastrophic for a society if you're saying that the people that care about child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation, that breaks down differently by ideological belief. I don't think any sensible person really believes that. I've had people in my DMs saying, "Oh, you left-wing scumbag, you have no problems with child being sexually assaulted, sexually abused, raped." I mean, I have a daughter. Not that it matters, of course, but I have a little girl. The idea it's just a monstrous idea that one's political value system, whether or not you believe in the public ownership of water, therefore means you have a certain intuitive response to children being abused. I think this is a really, really important moment for this country, Michael. This story. It's an ongoing story. It's obviously had a spotlight put back on it again by the likes of Elon Musk. But it's a really, really important story. It's a hugely important scandal. What happened particularly in Rotherham and Rochdale, these were the cornerstone cases of this scandal over a very long, protracted period of time. And I think it asks huge questions, Michael, of what kind of country we are. What kind of people matter? What kind of people are listened to? Are our national institutions capable of solving problems? And actually, we failed on every single count. So I understand the anger. But this idea that, the left is to blame. Well, first of all, obviously that's nonsense. But secondly, it doesn't help. Clearly something went very, very wrong with a number of police forces over a very long period of time. Like I said, local authorities as well. And we have had reports, inquiries. But as you said, I think already in this show, if you haven't, my apologies, I think I remember you saying it, and it's been said anyway, multiple times over the last 48, 72 hours, there were a number of recommendations made by a report under the last Conservative government. Not a single one has been actioned. Not a single one. And that, to me, is another part of the scandal. And it's another part of the story we need to shine a light on. Well, what is the point of having reports and inquiries if they make proposals to remediate the problems and then the political class doesn't do anything about it?
That's showing that there are lots of people more interested in making a political football out of this, and using this as an issue to sort of cast aspersions about, a whole ethnic group of people than actually to protect children. Now, I as I've said over and over again, I think the main issues here were class and misogyny, gender. I do think, it's Anne Cryer sort of said in that documentary that when she tried to bring this up, because she was an early, she came to this before it was a national story. She did say that there were people in the Labour Party who said, "Why are you talking about this? This sounds racist," right? So I think clearly, there are some lessons for the left to learn, but it's ridiculous to say the left enabled this, the left don't care about this. But people using stuff like this to play political football is not good, whatever side they're on. I think a victim is a victim, whoever the perpetrator is. A perpetrator is a perpetrator, whatever ethnic background they have. And I think that is, many lessons that should be taken from this, but that's one of them. John McDonnell is one of 7 Labour MPs who currently have the whip suspended. And the former Shadow Chancellor has now written a piece in The Guardian with a warning to the Prime Minister. He says there's a threat lurking right underneath Labour's nose, and it's from the left. The subheading, the party wants to seem in control, but many of its MPs have knife-edge majorities that a challenger could obliterate. After reading that article, I caught up with John to elaborate on what he wrote. But I started by asking John McDonnell to give an update on his own suspension.
If people recall, there were 7 of us suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party, so suspension of the whip, it's called. That was when we voted to scrap the 2-child limit. It's a 6-month suspension, so that 6 months are up now, and the decision will be taken. It'll be taken by Keir Starmer, basically, about whether they restore the whip to us, or whether they continue on, they renew it another 6 months, or they just continue it on. We'll know hopefully we'll know over the next few weeks.
And do you have any kind of prediction as to what will happen? Has there been any suggestion, official or otherwise, as to your prospects of being readmitted?
No, I've tried to pick up what I can by way of the sort of attitude that there is. It's interesting, quite a number of members of the Parliamentary Labour Party were a bit shocked when the whip was taken off us. And there's, interestingly enough, quite a number of the new members have bumped into me in the corridors in the Commons and things like that and expressed their concern about what happened. So I think most people want to just see it resolved and we can all move on. But who can tell? It's very difficult to know the decision-making processes around Keir Starmer's office and what their motivations are.
And I mean, presumably, I don't have any inside knowledge of how this works. Of course, I don't think anyone would expect me to with this current leadership. But I would imagine that there would be conditions for you to get your whip back. I imagine there would sort of be, you won't vote on amendments to budgets or finance bills and other things that you're supposed to do or not do. Are you going to be sort of willing and prepared to sign up to something like that?
Well, there was a 6-month suspension for one particular issue. So I'd expect that once the 6 months has been served, that's it. If they want to come back with conditions, well, we'd have to see what they are. But it's very difficult to abide by conditions when you don't really know what's coming up. There might be something significant of principle in the future, which I would want to vote differently from the whips, and that's the reality of being a member of Parliament. You have to make the judgments on the basis of what is best for your constituents, what's best for the country, and at that stage, it's difficult to sign an oath where you're never going to vote against something that the government brings forward, because there might be issues that are so significant, as significant as the 2-child limit was for a number of us. But anyway, we'll see what they come back with. If there's a whole range of draconian conditions, I think that most people would see that as unacceptable.
And let's talk about your intervention in The Guardian today. So sort of the argument being Keir Starmer seems very concerned with losing votes to the right, less concerned with losing votes to the left, and you think that's a mistake. I mean, are you sort of setting the scene for not your own launch of a left-wing party, but your friend Jeremy Corbyn launching a left-wing party, and you think that might happen soon and Keir Starmer needs to prepare?
The basis of my argument in The Guardian is this, that the Labour Party has been successful, I think most successful, when it's abided by the founding principles of the party, which is the broad church approach. You're bringing together a coalition of progressives on the left, right and centre. And in that way, one, you're stronger because you've got a range of ideas flowing in and you've got a range of talent as well from across the political spectrum on the left. But in addition to that, you're more reflective of what's in society itself. You're more reflective of the progressive left, right and centre of society. And if you try and break up that broad church, what then happens is you become increasingly unrepresentative of the very people you want to represent. And as a result of that, people get disillusioned. They don't know what to vote for. And what we've seen in the polls is a real collapse of our support, as you know, from the general election. But also in council by-election after council by-election, our loss of vote has been staggering. Anything between 10 and 30% drop in our vote. And in the council by-elections, it looks as though our vote is staying at home. So the consequences of disillusioning people, because you're breaking up that broad church approach, you're isolating a section, quite a significant section of that alliance that formed the Labour Party, is that people get disillusioned and they just stay at home. But there's also a risk, of course, there always has been, of those progressive left votes going elsewhere. And we have seen, there's evidence, the polling that was done, the research that was done by Compass, for example, demonstrated, yes, we have lost Labour votes to the Greens, we have lost them to the Lib Dems, yes, we've lost some to Reform as well, but the progressive left have gone to the Greens and the Lib Dems, not on any specific scale or significant scale at the moment, but actually what Reform has demonstrated is that the first past the post system no longer provides the same level of protection to the main political parties, Labour and Conservatives, that it did in the past. And I'm saying to the Labour Party, your risk in future elections is if you keep on isolating and undermining the left within that broad coalition of the Labour, the broad church, you will lose support through disillusionment, staying at home vote. And if there was an organisation on the left that came together, even though there's been successive failures of this in the past, even if that took a few hundred votes in certain constituencies, Labour's majority at the moment is based on a large number of constituencies that we only won with a few hundred votes. So I'm saying basically to those that are making decisions, strategic decisions within the Labour Party, what you're doing is you're risking the undermining of that broad church approach. And as a result of that, yeah, you've got threats from the right, but the warning is actually you've got problems on the left as well, as people will stay at home disillusioned, or go to the Greens, or go to the Lib Dems, or if there is a new left formation, go into that new left formation. And the solution is return to the principles upon which the Labour Party was founded, which is that broad church approach, but also respect for different views within the party, and also respect for the democratic procedures within the Labour Party as well, particularly of the selection of candidates, whether it's a council candidate or a parliamentary candidate. So it's a warning, if you like, to what the risks are if the path that they're pursuing at the moment is continued.
And is this a sort of a problem that you've identified about sort of how they treat people or about policy? So, I mean, is this intervention to say you need to give us back the whip to restore Labour to being a broad church, or is it to say you need to start implementing some more left-wing policies to more effectively compete with the Greens or any other sort of independent left-wing Labour Party that sets up?
That's a more fundamental point about democracy and the nature of Labour Party and socialist democracy in particular. So, of course, that has implications for policy, because if you close down debate within the party, if you close down the development of ideas, and if you don't encourage debate and the development of ideas, what happens is you start implementing policies which are unacceptable, quite a significant majority within our party and elsewhere. So, for example, look at the reason that the Labour Party has dipped in popularity in this recent period is there have been some staggering mistakes on policy. Two-child limit, I think, was a huge mistake to leave another 500,000 children in poverty. But the winter fuel allowance cut, which came out of the blue, that wasn't consulted on, it wasn't debated, it wasn't discussed, and yet it came out of the blue and has alienated a large number of our own members, as well as our supporters, as well as the general population. Then again, the WASPI decision not to provide any form of justice to the WASPI women, again, not consulted on, not debated. And I think if there had been a free vote amongst the Parliamentary Labour Party members, and certainly amongst Labour Party members, we would have a compensation scheme being put in place for the WASPI women. So there's issues like that which demonstrate when you start disrespecting the democratic principles of our party, you make mistakes and policy decisions that are flying the face of, I think, the core beliefs of our party. That's the first thing. The second thing, it does relate to people in position. We've just seen over these last few days, it was actually after I'd written the article, but what happened in Broxtowe, where a large number of the sitting Labour councillors were told they wouldn't be selected for the council elections in May. And a large number of them, with party members, have now left the party and formed an independent group. And selections have been so tightly controlled at council and parliamentary level. Local party members are thinking, well, why am I a member of this party when I can't have a say over who's going to represent me in my local ward or in my constituency party? So it undermines the whole process of democracy in the party when you start excluding, as I say, that key element, I think, of the broad church of the Labour Party.
You know, on the issues of the winter fuel payment, the 2-child cap limit, most of our audience will, of course, agree that they were mistakes that the Labour leadership made. I suppose a sort of challenge one could make to your idea of Labour Party democracy is if you put this out to a vote of MPs or members or whatever, they're never going to support really cutting anything. And Rachel Reeves is going to say, we've got to, we're having a difficult time when it comes to budgeting because growth has been so slow, et cetera, et cetera. So sort of what kind of vision for Labour policy could you put forward that you think someone like Rachel Reeves doing her bean counting in the Treasury might agree to?
The issue is the choices you have to make around the distribution of wealth and income within our country, isn't it, basically? And if in the preparation for a general election, you're ruling out increases in income tax, even on the wealthiest within our society, you're ruling out a wealth tax, and you're ruling out the increase in corporation tax. So in other words, on the corporations that are making the greatest profits within our economy, you box yourself into a situation where then you're looking at cuts. And that's why I think there was a huge mistake made in the run-up to the general election in limiting the flexibility of an incoming government, that these mistakes were then made. So therefore, I think if you were having that debate over the winter fuel allowance or over the 2-child limit, and you put to members of the Parliamentary Labour Party or the general membership of the Labour Party and said, look, we either increase income tax on the wealthiest and the ones with the largest incomes, exactly as Keir said we were supposed to be doing, which is those with the broadest shoulders should carry the heaviest burden. Either we're increasing income tax on those wealthiest, or we're cutting the winter fuel allowance or not scrapping the 2-child limit. I think I know which way Labour Party members would vote. And it would be about a traditional, very traditional, social democratic redistribution of income and wealth within our society to tackle poverty. And I think actually that's a mainstream view within the Labour Party.
And I imagine lots of our viewers will agree with what you've just said. I imagine there will be some, though, saying, John McDonnell, he's kidding himself. Keir Starmer has no interest whatsoever in listening to the left. The left-wing MPs are basically being humiliated by being suspended and then sort of having to beg to be let back in. It's time that John McDonnell and his ilk sort of stood up to Starmer, left the party, started a new party with Jeremy Corbyn, perhaps joined the Greens, but sort of asserted their independence and said, we're no longer going to be subject to the dictates of a party leadership that clearly doesn't like us very much and doesn't want us to be involved. How would you respond to that?
I've been in the party 50 years now, and these things come in waves. And what seems certain in one period can rapidly change in another. And within the Labour Party, it's always been, with the old language, it's always been a terrain of struggle. Well, that battle goes on within the Labour Party, and it may look a pretty tough battle at the moment, but things change, and often they can change rapidly. The key issue for us now is that we've got a Labour government that is becoming rapidly unpopular. That's resulting, unfortunately, as well, in a level of disillusionment within society that is shifting people's attitudes and support towards the right. And I actually do think with reform and the interventions from Musk and others, we're in a really dangerous situation. We've seen what's happened in Italy. We've seen the rise in France as well, and Germany of the far right. And I think we're in a really dangerous situation. That's why my view at the moment is that we need to wake up the Labour Party to the seriousness of the situation, for them to recognise that by destroying the broad church approach of the Labour Party, you're putting the whole of our society into a vulnerable position with regard to the extreme right. And that's why we need a united progressive left voice speaking up for working class people within our society. So I don't think the game is up within the Labour Party. I know others think it has. I think the struggle is still there. And as I see, things can change pretty rapidly. And you're talking to the person who, in 2015, at that point in time, most people didn't think we'd be able to get Jeremy Corbyn on a ballot paper, let alone become leader of the Labour Party. And I was the person who did the organisation with others, of course, to get Jeremy on the ballot paper and to manage his election campaign for the leadership of the party. So things can change. And as I say, these things come in waves. I actually do think there's a new wave building across our society, particularly in the younger generation on the progressive left, fighting on a whole range of causes, whether it's on the issues of Gaza or it's on individual industrial struggles or campaigns for civil liberties. I think that's building all the time now, and that's the opportunity then of building that sort of progressive left voice. The Labour Party, because its traditional connection to the working class and trade unions in particular, I think is still the potential vehicle for that. So that's why I don't think the game is up yet on the Labour Party, and that's why I'm willing to spend this coming period trying to, I think, restore that tradition of the broad church, because in that way we'll be stronger to fend off the far right.
We'll be back tomorrow. Normal service has resumed. So come back tomorrow at 6 p.m. for another episode of Novara Live. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.